Captain James Carter had always been known for his bravery. He was a soldier who never backed down, even when faced with impossible odds. But when the Galactic Council condemned him to die on Katara 9, a desolate desert planet, his fate seemed sealed. The desert was a place where nothing could survive. No plants, no animals, just endless dunes and harsh, unforgiving winds. A place no one would want to visit, let alone be sentenced to live and die in. Yet James didn't go down without a fight. As the transport shuttle dropped him off on the barren planet, James was already preparing himself for what would likely be his final days. He had been found guilty of defying the Council's orders, and this desert planet was supposed to be his punishment. The Council had ensured that no help would be coming for him. They'd stripped him of his advanced technology, leaving him only with the basic survival gear: water, food rations, and a small handheld device for communication that would probably never work in the planet's atmospheric conditions. With no other choice, James started walking, heading into the sandstorm on the horizon, knowing it would be a matter of time before his body gave in to the harsh conditions. The sandstorms were violent, and the temperature swung from burning hot to freezing cold in a matter of hours. But James had been trained for this. He knew how to survive in hostile environments. He just needed to keep moving. For hours, he trekked through the sand, trying to conserve energy and preserve his limited resources. He had to find shelter before the nightfall. The first day passed slowly, and as darkness fell, James found a cave hidden beneath a massive rock formation. Inside, he set up camp, feeling the weight of his situation. This could very well be the end. But it wasn't the desert or the deadly storms that would prove to be his biggest challenge. It was what James discovered the next morning. As the sandstorms cleared, revealing a strange, almost unnatural stillness in the air, he saw something he hadn't expected: movement in the distance. His instincts kicked in, and he crouched low behind a rock, watching carefully. The figures he saw were unlike anything he had encountered before. They were humanoid but distinct, taller than most humans, with smooth, almost translucent skin. Their eyes were large and piercing, and their bodies radiated an eerie kind of grace and strength. The women moved like warriors, poised, powerful, and focused. It was clear these were no ordinary beings. James felt a wave of confusion and fear. He'd been sent here to die, not to meet alien women who were clearly not human. What were they? Why were they on this harsh planet? Did they live here, or were they just passing through? James had no answers, but one thing was clear: he couldn't let them see him. He needed to find out who they were and why they were here before they noticed him. The aliens seemed to be scouting the area, moving with military precision. James knew they had to be dangerous. There was no way these beings would let him survive if they saw him. So he did what any seasoned soldier would do. He stayed hidden. He waited, watching them carefully, trying to understand their patterns. Were they scouting, or were they just travelers like him? As the day wore on, James realized something that struck him like a lightning bolt. These alien women weren't just passing through. They had been watching him for some time. And now, it was too late for him to remain unnoticed. One of the women locked eyes with him from a distance, and in that instant, everything changed. Before he could react, she raised a hand and signaled to the others. They surrounded him quickly, their movements precise and coordinated. James felt the weight of their presence, the tension in the air, as they closed in on him. He had no choice now. He stood up, ready for anything. The leader of the group, a tall, fierce-looking woman with silver eyes, spoke in a language James didn't understand. Her voice was commanding, yet calm, and there was no mistaking the authority in her tone. She pointed at him, then at the desert around them, as if questioning why he was there. James tried to communicate, but the language barrier was too great. His only option was to play it cool, to keep them from seeing him as a threat. He raised his hands in surrender, hoping they would see him as nothing more than an unfortunate human stranded on their planet. But the woman's eyes didn't soften. Instead, she took a step forward, sizing him up with a glance that made James feel like an insect beneath her boot. She was assessing him, testing him. But for what? The moment stretched on, the silence heavy between them. James knew that one wrong move could end it all. He could feel the heat of their stares, the weight of their judgment. If they saw him as weak, they would likely kill him on the spot. But he wasn't weak. He wasn't going to die here. Not today. Not without a fight. Then, in a surprising turn of events, the leader's stance softened. She nodded slightly, as if she had reached some unspoken conclusion about him. With a flick of her wrist, she gestured to the others, signaling them to lower their weapons. James didn't know what had changed, but he wasn't about to argue. He simply nodded back, silently promising that he wasn't a threat. The group began to move again, but they didn't take their eyes off him. James followed from a distance, unsure of their next move. One thing was certain: his journey on this planet was far from over. And if he wanted to survive, he would need to understand these alien women. Their fear of humans was real, but there was something more to them, something James couldn't yet understand. It was a mystery he had to solve, if only to survive. James had no idea what to expect when the alien women took him away from the rocky outcrop where he had been hiding. The tall, silver-eyed woman, the leader of the group, didn't say much as they moved swiftly across the desert terrain, forcing James to keep up with them. The harsh wind blew the fine sand around them, making it hard to see, but the group of women seemed unaffected by it, moving with precision and confidence. They didn't slow down, and neither did James, who was already feeling the weight of his situation pressing on him. As they reached a hidden settlement nestled in the cliffs, James's eyes widened. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. The place was a mix of high-tech structures and ancient stone, blending into the desert landscape in a way that was both eerie and beautiful. It felt like a place that had been forgotten by time, as if the rest of the universe had moved on, while these women had stayed behind. They led him to a large central building. The architecture was strange: sharp, angular lines and glowing symbols carved into the walls, giving off a soft, blue light. Inside, the air was cool, and the walls hummed with quiet energy. As they entered, James noticed that the entire structure was filled with alien technology, far more advanced than anything he had ever seen. Yet the women still seemed to rely on old-fashioned tools, like spears and knives, suggesting that their culture had a strange mix of the ancient and the futuristic. The leader, whose name James learned was Lyra, motioned for him to sit on the ground as she spoke to him in a language he didn't understand. Her tone was firm, but not hostile. She seemed to be asking him questions, but there was no way for him to answer. The language barrier was a problem. The alien women didn't seem to be able to speak any human languages, and James only knew a few words in alien dialects. They appeared frustrated, but James remained calm, knowing he had to gain their trust if he wanted to survive. Lyra was still studying him closely, her silver eyes never leaving his face. James could feel the weight of her gaze, and he realized just how different these women were from anything he had ever encountered. They were tall, graceful, and strong. Everything about them screamed power. But there was something else in their eyes. Fear. Fear of the unknown. Fear of humans. They had probably never encountered someone like him before. He wasn't just a man to them. He was an intruder, a possible threat to their way of life. After what seemed like an eternity of silence, one of the other women, a smaller but equally intense figure, approached James. She had dark blue skin and eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light of the room. She spoke to Lyra in their language, and Lyra nodded before turning back to James. There was a hint of something softer in her expression now, almost as if she was beginning to understand that he wasn't an enemy. James knew that he needed to do something, anything, to show them that he wasn't a threat. He gestured to his chest, trying to communicate that he was human, not some invading force. Lyra and the others exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. He couldn't tell if they were understanding him, or if they thought he was just some strange creature from a distant world. But he had no other choice but to keep trying. As the hours passed, James was led to another part of the settlement. This area was filled with strange machines and devices, each one more advanced than anything on Earth. He was fascinated, but also cautious. He didn't know what any of these machines did, but he had the feeling that the women were watching him closely, waiting for him to make a move. He could sense that they were trying to figure him out just as much as he was trying to understand them. During the following days, Lyra and the others taught him some of their language, and James did his best to reciprocate. It was slow going, but eventually he managed to communicate a few basic ideas. He learned that these women were the Xaran, an ancient race who had chosen to live in isolation from the rest of the galaxy. They had once been part of a mighty empire, but over time, they had become outcasts, hiding from the galaxy's chaos in their desert home. Despite their beauty and strength, the Xaran women were terrified of humans. They had heard stories of human conquest, of wars fought over resources and power, and they believed that Earth's people were no different from the other invaders who had come to their world in the past. They saw James as just another threat to their fragile peace. James spent every day trying to prove that he wasn't like the others. He helped with tasks around the settlement, using his survival skills to build shelters and create defenses for them. It wasn't easy, especially since the Xaran were so set in their ways. They had lived without the need for outsiders for so long, and the idea of trusting someone like him was foreign to them. Lyra watched him closely, her expression unreadable. But over time, James began to notice subtle changes in her behavior. She would catch his eye when he wasn't looking, and sometimes he could swear she was almost curious about him. He wasn't sure if it was just his imagination, but he felt like she was starting to see him as something more than just an enemy. One evening, as the two of them sat by a fire, Lyra spoke to him in their language. James didn't understand every word, but he could tell she was asking him about Earth. He gestured to the stars above them, pointing to the vastness of space, trying to explain that there were many worlds, many races. He spoke of Earth, of humanity's struggles and triumphs. As he did, he noticed Lyra's expression softening, and for the first time, he felt like they were beginning to connect on some level. But as much as James tried to bridge the gap between them, he knew that there was still a long way to go. The Xaran women were fiercely protective of their world, and James was still an outsider. They were beginning to trust him, but trust would take time. Every day was a new challenge, and every moment felt like a test. The fear in their eyes wasn't completely gone, but it was starting to fade, replaced by something else, something more curious, something that James hadn't expected: respect. James had begun to realize that survival on this desert planet would require more than just brute strength or his skills as a soldier. He had to earn the trust of the Xaran women, especially Lyra, the leader. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was his only option. Every day, he tried to prove himself useful, and slowly, he began to notice small shifts in how they viewed him. They weren't quite ready to accept him fully, but there was a growing respect for him, a subtle change that gave him hope. In the beginning, the Xaran women had treated him with suspicion. They would observe him from a distance, and any attempt he made to speak or help was met with silence or cold indifference. But over the days, he had shown them that he wasn't a threat. He was just a man who had been abandoned, forced to survive in a place where death was a constant companion. And slowly, their attitude began to change. Lyra, especially, had started to soften. At first, she was stoic and distant, a silent observer of everything James did. But as time passed, she began to speak to him more. She would ask him questions about Earth and humans, and he would share what he knew. Sometimes, the conversation was slow and awkward, with lots of gestures and broken words, but the effort was there. Lyra pointed to the top of the rock, and James understood. She wanted him to climb it. It wasn't just a test of physical strength. James realized it was a test of trust. Lyra was testing him to see if he could handle the challenges of the desert, the very thing that had been sent to kill him. If he could conquer the rock, perhaps he could prove to her that he wasn't just a weak, stranded human. Without hesitation, James began to climb, his hands and feet gripping the jagged edges of the rock. The climb was difficult, but he had done far more challenging things in his life. He focused on the task at hand, ignoring the harsh sun and the burning sensation in his arms. As he neared the top, he glanced down to see Lyra watching him. Her expression was unreadable, but he could tell she was waiting for something, waiting to see if he could prove his worth. When James reached the top, he felt a sense of accomplishment. The wind howled around him, and the desert stretched out in every direction, an endless sea of sand. He turned and waved down at Lyra, signaling that he had made it. She didn't smile, but there was a flicker of approval in her eyes. She nodded and turned to leave, signaling for him to follow her. Over the next few weeks, their relationship continued to evolve. James became more integrated into the daily life of the Terran women. He helped them with various tasks, building shelters, gathering food, and fortifying their settlement against the occasional sandstorm. The work was hard, but James found that the more he contributed, the more the Terran women began to respect him. They would speak to him in their language, though he could only understand a fraction of what they said. But every time they interacted, he learned something new. Lyra, in particular, began to spend more time with him. She would ask him to help with various projects, and during these moments, James noticed something that took him by surprise. Lyra seemed to be warming up to him. She still maintained her serious demeanor, but there was something softer in her gaze, a flicker of something that resembled affection, though she wouldn't openly admit it. One evening, as they sat by a campfire, Lyra handed James a small bowl filled with a strange glowing liquid. He looked at it with confusion, and Lyra gestured for him to drink. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of what it was, but then took a sip. To his surprise, it tasted sweet and refreshing. He looked at Lyra, and she nodded, as if to say that it was a gesture of trust. "Thank you," James said, using the few words of their language he had learned. Lyra didn't respond immediately, but she did offer a small nod, acknowledging his gratitude. As the days passed, James noticed that the bond between them was growing. They began to share more personal stories. James told Lyra about Earth, about the people, the struggles and the triumphs of his world. Lyra shared the history of her people, the Xaran, and how they had once been part of a mighty empire that had crumbled under the weight of its own ambition. She spoke of the great wars, the betrayals, and the losses that had driven her people to seek refuge on this desert world. The more she spoke, the more James realized that they weren't so different. The Xaran women were survivors, just like humans. They had faced destruction, loss, and uncertainty, and they had learned to live with it. One evening, as they sat together by the fire, James found himself thinking about how far they had come. From the moment he had crash-landed on this planet, he had been an outsider, an enemy in their eyes. But now, they were starting to see him as something else, a fellow survivor. They had begun to trust him, and he had begun to trust them. Lyra, still sitting beside him, glanced over and met his gaze. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was an understanding between them, something unspoken but clear. They weren't enemies anymore, and perhaps they never really had been. The desert had a way of making people rethink what they thought they knew, and James realized that he had begun to respect Lyra and her people, just as they had begun to respect him. The connection between James and Lyra was growing stronger with every passing day. What had begun as mutual suspicion had transformed into something deeper, a bond built on respect, shared survival, and the quiet understanding that they were both living in a world where survival was the only thing that mattered. They still had a long way to go before they could fully understand each other, but James felt that they were on the right path. And in that moment, he knew that his mission had changed. It was no longer about surviving the desert. It was about understanding the XRN, and maybe even finding a way to work together to protect this world they had come to call home. The peace that had started to grow between James and the XRN women was shattered one fateful day. The skies had turned dark, the winds picking up with unusual speed, carrying the heavy scent of something dangerous. James could feel it in his bones. Something was coming. Lyra had been on edge all day, and James couldn't help but wonder if she had sensed it too. The tension in the air was thick as they worked together to reinforce their camp. It didn't take long for the threat to reveal itself. From the distance, a shadow moved swiftly across the horizon, and James squinted, trying to make out the shape. Then his heart skipped a beat as he saw it clearly. A group of heavily armored aliens appeared on the ridgeline, their sleek, black ships descending from the sky. The hostile race that Xarin had been at war with, the Zair, had found them. Lyra's face hardened as she looked toward the approaching enemy. The calm and collected leader that James had come to respect now showed signs of fear, but also fierce determination. "The Zair," she muttered under her breath, barely audible. "They've come for us again." James quickly assessed the situation. These weren't just any regular invaders. The Zair were technologically advanced, their ships equipped with cloaking devices and devastating weaponry. They had hunted the Khtaran for years, seeking to wipe out the last remnants of their people. This was no small raid. It was an all-out assault. And for the first time since he had arrived on this planet, James felt the full weight of what it meant to fight for survival. There was no time for hesitation. The Xarin women were already preparing themselves, gathering weapons and ammunition. Lyra moved quickly, barking orders to her people, her voice sharp and commanding. James was thrust into action with them, but it wasn't easy. His skills as a soldier were good, but against the Zair's advanced tech, they were nothing but underdogs. But one thing he had learned from his time on Earth, and that Xarin women had taught him, was that when the stakes were high, survival wasn't just about strength or technology. It was about heart. Lyra handed James a weapon, something he'd never seen before, a strange energy rifle designed to fire bursts of concentrated plasma. He wasn't sure how it worked, but he knew how to use it. He checked the charge, knowing that every shot could be his last. The Xarin women had a few weapons, but they were outgunned and outnumbered. Their only advantage was the terrain. The desert might be a harsh place, but it was also home to them, and they knew how to fight in it. James stood alongside Lyra, facing the advancing Zair. The Zair had no mercy. They were ruthless, and they were here for one thing: to destroy. The sound of their ship's engines echoed in the air, sending vibrations through the ground beneath them. As the first of the enemy soldiers began to land, James took a deep breath. He felt his heart pounding in his chest, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The battle was about to begin. The Zair soldiers descended from their ships, wearing thick, black armor that reflected the harsh desert sun. They were tall, humanoid creatures with sharp, angular features and glowing red eyes. They carried high-powered plasma guns and energy shields that made them nearly invulnerable to conventional weapons. But that didn't stop James and the Xarin women. They fought with everything they had, using the environment to their advantage. James fired his weapon, the plasma bolt streaking through the air toward the Zair. He could see the enemy soldiers staggering back, their shields flaring with each hit, but they didn't fall. They had the advantage of technology, and that was something James couldn't overcome with just firepower. Lyra and the other Xarin women fought with incredible precision, using the cover of the rocks and dunes to stay hidden from the Zair's line of sight. They moved in groups, striking quickly before retreating back into the desert. It was a guerrilla tactic, and it was their only chance. James followed their lead, taking cover behind a large rock formation as a group of Zair soldiers advanced toward his position. He could hear the sound of their boots crunching in the sand, the low hum of their plasma rifles charging up. His fingers tightened around the trigger as he fired again, hitting one of the soldiers in the chest. The Zair stumbled, his armor sparking from the impact, but he didn't fall. James swore under his breath. It was frustrating. He couldn't fight them head-on. The Zare were too powerful, but he wasn't about to give up. He had learned the hard way that when you fight for your life, you can't afford to back down. As the battle raged on, the Xaran women began to take casualties. James saw one of them fall, a shot to the chest sending her crashing to the sand. Her weapon skidded across the ground, but she didn't move. The sight of her lifeless body stirred something deep within James. The pain was unbearable, but it also fueled him. He couldn't let them die for nothing. He wouldn't let the Xaran people be wiped out, not while he still had breath in his body. Lyra's voice broke through the chaos. "Fall back. To the caverns," she shouted. "We cannot win this battle, but we can survive." James didn't hesitate. He followed Lyra and the remaining Xaran women as they retreated into the desert, using the rocky terrain to mask their movements. The Zare weren't willing to let them escape, but the Xaran knew the desert better than anyone. They led James through a series of hidden caves where they could regroup and plan their next move. As they made their way deeper into the caves, James couldn't help but feel the weight of the loss. The Xaran women had fought valiantly, but they were outmatched. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about finding a way to push back against the Zare and protect the future of the Xaran people. And James was determined to make sure that, no matter what, they wouldn't be destroyed. But the fight was far from over. The Zare had shown no mercy, and James knew that this was just the beginning. The battle for survival had only just begun, and he was ready for whatever came next. The cave was silent, except for the heavy breathing of the group. The walls, damp with the heat of the desert, echoed with each labored breath. James sat against the cold rock, his energy spent after the brutal battle. The Xaran women had retreated into the safety of the caves, but the reality of their situation was undeniable. They were running out of time, out of supplies, and out of options. Lyra paced in front of the group, her face drawn with worry. The others sat in silence, their eyes hollow with exhaustion and grief. There had been losses. The bodies of their fallen comrades weighed heavily on everyone's mind. The memory of their faces burned into James's memory. He could still hear the sound of the plasma blasts, see the flash of light as one of the Xaran women fell. It felt like a punch to the gut every time he thought about it. But Lyra's voice cut through the silence, strong and resolute. "We cannot let their sacrifice be in vain," she said, her tone fierce. "We have one chance left. We know the Zare's weakness. It's their command ship." James looked up at her, his eyes meeting hers. He knew what she was implying. If they could take down the Zare command ship, they could cripple the entire fleet. It was a long shot, a dangerous one, but it was their only hope. "I'm in," James said, standing up with determination. He didn't need to say more. Lyra nodded, and the other Xaran women exchanged glances, their resolve hardening. They had come this far, and they weren't going to give up now. The plan was risky, but it was their only option. The Zare command ship was well protected, hovering above the desert in the distance. It was heavily shielded and surrounded by Zare warships, but Lyra knew that they could use the terrain to their advantage. The desert was full of hidden ravines, canyons, and natural formations that could give them cover as they made their way toward the ship. "We move at dawn," Lyra said. "It's our only chance to take them by surprise." The group spent the rest of the night preparing, double-checking their weapons and ensuring they had enough supplies to make the journey. James worked alongside the Xaran women, sharing the burden of preparation. There was no time for fear, no time for second thoughts. They had to act, and they had to act now. As dawn broke, the group set out, moving through the desert in silence. The harsh sun rose slowly over the horizon, casting a blood-red light over the landscape. The wind kicked up the sand, swirling around them as they navigated the rocky terrain. Every step felt heavy, like they were walking through a dream that might end at any moment. But James couldn't afford to think about that. He couldn't afford to doubt. Not now. They reached the base of a rocky cliff by mid-morning, and from there they could see the Zir command ship hovering in the distance. It was even bigger than James had imagined, its dark metallic surface reflecting the sun's light like a shadow over the desert. It was surrounded by Zir warships, their engines glowing as they hovered in the air. "Do you think we can make it?" James asked quietly, his eyes scanning the scene. He could feel his heart beating faster, his mind racing with possibilities. "We have no choice," Lyra replied. "We must." The group moved quickly, staying low to the ground as they crept closer to the Zir ships. The tension was unbearable, every sound amplified in the quiet desert. James's hand tightened around his plasma rifle, ready for whatever came next. He could feel the eyes of the Xaren women on him, their trust in him as solid as a rock. He had to do this for them, for the fallen, for Lyra, and for the future of their people. They finally reached a narrow canyon that led straight to the base of the Zir command ship. From here, they could see the ship's weak points, areas where the Zir's shields didn't extend. This was their moment. With a plan in mind, they set to work. James and Lyra led the charge, the others following closely behind. They moved in synchronized steps, a well-trained unit despite their differences in skill. As they got closer to the ship, the Zir's sensors seemed to detect them. The hum of their ship's engines grew louder, and the sound of weapons charging sent a wave of adrenaline through James. He felt a surge of energy. This was it, the final stand. "Now," Lyra shouted. The Xaren women broke cover, opening fire on the nearest Zir ships. Plasma bolts flew through the air, hitting shields and lighting up the sky. James joined the fray, his own plasma rifle roaring as he aimed at the weak points Lyra had pointed out. The Zir retaliated, their weapons firing in all directions. The air crackled with the sound of energy blasts, and the desert floor shook under the force of the explosions. James's heart raced as he dodged behind a rock formation, narrowly avoiding a direct hit. His thoughts flashed to the faces of the Xaren women who had fallen. Bonner, the brave soldier who had given his life without hesitation. Her face was burned into his memory, and her sacrifice fueled his fight. He couldn't let her death be in vain. Lyra and the others fought with unmatched intensity. There was no fear in their eyes, only determination. They fought for each other, for the fallen, and for the future of their people. The Zir were formidable, but the Xaren women were resilient, and James knew that together they could overcome anything. As the battle reached its peak, the Zir's command ship began to lose altitude. Their shields flickered, and the ship's engines sputtered as they tried to recover. James could see the light of victory in Lyra's eyes, but it was fleeting. They were not out of danger yet. They needed to finish what they started. With one final push, James and the Xaren women launched an all-out assault. Their weapons tore into the ship's vulnerable points, and with a deafening explosion, the Zir command ship came crashing down to the desert floor. The sound of the ship's destruction was deafening, but the sense of relief that washed over James was even stronger. As the dust settled, James collapsed to the ground, his body exhausted, but his heart filled with pride. They had done it. Against all odds, they had won. The Zir were defeated, and the Xaren women had their freedom. But victory had come at a high cost. James looked around at the faces of the Xaren women, their expressions a mixture of triumph and sorrow. They had lost so much, and yet they had gained so much more. It wasn't just the victory that mattered, though. It was the bonds they had formed, the friendships, the trust, the respect. These were the things that made the battle worth fighting, the things that made the harsh desert worth enduring. As they neared the foot of the mountain range, Lyra stopped and turned to face James. There was something different in her eyes now, something deeper. She had always been a fierce leader, but now she looked at him as an equal, a friend, perhaps even something more. "James," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion, I don't know how to thank you for what you've done. You've changed everything for us." James felt a lump form in his throat. He didn't know what to say. Words seemed inadequate. Instead, he took a step forward, closing the distance between them. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of everything they had been through pressing down on them. Then, without thinking, James reached out and took her hand. Lyra looked up at him, surprised at first, but then she smiled. It was a soft, genuine smile, one that made James's heart skip a beat. They had both lost so much, but in each other, they had found something worth fighting for. "We'll make it," Lyra said, squeezing his hand. "We'll rebuild. Together." James nodded, his heart swelling with emotion. He had come to this desert expecting nothing but death, but instead he had found a new purpose. He had found a family in the most unexpected place. As they began their ascent into the mountains, James knew that the battle was over, but the journey was far from complete. There was still much to be done, many challenges to face, but for the first time since arriving on this planet, he felt hope. The Xaran women were no longer just survivors. They were a people with a future, and James was no longer a soldier sent to die. He was a part of something much greater, a family that would rise from the ashes of war. In the end, their triumph was not just about defeating the Zair. It was about survival, about overcoming the odds, and about the bonds they had forged along the way. And as they walked into the future, side by side, James knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. Lyra stepped forward, her eyes locking with James. There were no words needed. They had been through too much together. They had fought and bled for each other. And in the end, they had won. Their final stand had been worth it. But James knew that this was just the beginning. The war was over, but the future was still uncertain. The Xaran women were free, but they had a long road ahead of them. James had come to this desert to die, but now he had found something worth fighting for. A new family, new friends, and a future that was still full of possibilities. The dust from the fallen Zair command ship still hung in the air, thick and heavy, settling over the desert like a grim reminder of the battle they had just fought. James and the Xaran women stood in the quiet aftermath, their breaths slow and labored, their bodies exhausted but triumphant. They had done it. Against all odds, they had defeated the Zair. James looked around at the faces of the Xaran women. Their eyes, once filled with fear and uncertainty, now shone with a newfound sense of hope. Lyra, the brave leader who had guided them through this impossible mission, stood beside him, her gaze soft but resolute. The others, too, wore expressions of quiet pride. Each of them had fought with everything they had, sacrificing more than James could ever fully comprehend. They had been through so much together, and they had won. But victory had come at a great cost. As James surveyed the wreckage of the battle, his thoughts turned to the fallen. Bonner's face flashed in his mind. The brave warrior who had sacrificed for life so that others might live. James clenched his fists at his sides. They couldn't forget her, or the others who had given everything. Their deaths would not be in vain. "We did it," Lyra said, her voice soft but full of conviction. She turned to James, meeting his eyes. "You did it, James. You saved us. You saved our people." James didn't know how to respond. What words could he possibly offer in the face of such gratitude? Instead, he simply nodded, his heart swelling with emotion. They were free now, free from the oppressive rule of the Zair. The Xaran people had a future, because of him, because of them, because they had fought together. But even as the victory settled in, the reality of their situation began to sink in. They were stranded in the middle of a hostile desert, their supplies running low. The battle with the Zair had taken everything they had. There was no time to celebrate. The desert was still a dangerous place, and the threat of other Zair forces remained. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. Lyra spoke first. "We need to get out of here. We need to find shelter and regroup. We can't stay in the open for too long." James nodded in agreement. It was a grim reality, but it was the truth. They needed to act quickly if they were to survive. As much as he longed to rest, he knew that the next step was just as crucial as the one they had just taken. The group moved quickly, gathering what little they had left. James felt a strange sense of pride as he worked alongside the Xaran women. There was no hierarchy now, no division. They were a team, and that bond had grown stronger through their shared experiences. He had come to this desert as a lone human soldier, sent to die, but now he had found something he never expected. Friends, allies, a family. "We'll head to the mountains," Lyra suggested, her voice calm despite the urgency in her words. "It's a long journey, but we'll be safer there. The Zir can't track us as easily in the mountains." The group set off, walking through the barren desert. The sun beat down relentlessly, the heat nearly unbearable, but they kept moving, one foot in front of the other. James could feel his muscles aching, the weight of the battle still hanging over him, but he pushed forward. They had come too far to stop now. As they walked, James found himself reflecting on everything that had led to this point. When he had first arrived on this desert planet, he had been nothing more than a pawn, a sacrifice sent by the Galactic Council. He had been expected to die, to be a tool in a war he didn't understand. But somehow, against all odds, he had survived. And in doing so, he had changed everything. He had saved the Xaran women, stopped the Zir, and given hope to a people who had long been oppressed.